aspects within this topic. And the deliverable of these task groups is generally to write a document. And this is just a screenshot of the latest from the ICRP, and you can see that they cover a range of topics. There's so many in radiation therapy, pregnancy and medical radiation, protecting your hands, nuclear medicine. You know, and these documents, I find them are very readable. They're designed to be read by specialists and regulators. So I think that they're very well written and they're extremely well researched before. So if you need to find out anything radiation, ICRP has probably got a book about it. Most of these documents as well are generally free as well, just to download from the website. Another important international body is the International Atomic Energy Agency. I think they're a branch of the UN. They are a member of the Security Council, but they're very high up in the of the United Nations. And despite having the word atomic energy in their title, they actually do a lot of research and work in medicine as well. So they again provide technical advice on safe use of radiation in imaging and therapy. Again, they publish quite regularly in, again, what I think are quite readable documents. And specifically for myself, there's two very appropriate documentations: radiation protection for the safety of medical uses of ionizing radiation, and occupational radiation protection. So these two documents really describe everything that we should be doing or could be doing with the use of radiation in medicine. However, ICRP and IAEA, they're international advisory bodies. They are not a regulator. The ICRP won't come to your hospital and say, show us how you comply with this. They have no regulatory role. So what happens is various scientific groups, they review data, they review literature, and they identify issues with the use of radiation. ICRP then also looks at these topics as well, and from time to time they make recommendations. A good example is, I think 5 or 6 years ago, there was concerns about the prevalence of cataracts in radiologists. ICRP looked at the epidemiology, looked at the dosimetry, looked at the radio sensitivity of the eye, decided that the radiation dose limit needed to come down to protect the eyes, specifically of radiologists, but I think it applies to all the workers. So ICRP makes recommendations, and they work very, very closely with people like ourselves, with national physics groups, with national radiation protection groups. Because we're the people on the ground, we're the people who work with the radiologists, and ICRP will come to us for advice and information. It's various international safety standards as well. But this is the important thing. This is your national regulations. So these are the people who have the legal authority to come to your workplace and ask you to show evidence that you're complying with the regulations. Now, here in Australia, we're regulated on a basis. So in Victoria, in Melbourne, where we're here now, we're regulated by the Victorian Department of Health. If you go to New South Wales, their environment, there might just be one regulator. In Australia, but 9. But Victoria regulates Victoria, New South Wales regulates New South Wales, and they're the important people who can come to your workplace and ask for evidence of compliance.
About 5 minutes.
Yeah, now nearly there. So whatever your regulations are in your country, they will reflect the ICRP principles of radiation protection, being justification, being one of them, where use of so the benefit of the patient. And this considers life expectancy, their potential for pregnancy, and previous radiation therapy. Once we've decided that our use of radiation is to bring the benefit and that we can benefit outweighs the risk, we then need to optimize that use of radiation. And this is all medical physics. This is what we're doing, is we are maximizing the use of it. So for therapy, as Thomas described earlier, we want to deliver the dose to a defined target and keep the dose to non-targets below any constraints. And in imaging, we want to get the right and appropriate picture quality so we can see what we think is going on. We don't want to overexpose the patient because that just doesn't bring any extra benefit. But we don't want to underexpose the patient, which risks having repeated scans. In terms of workers, optimization includes what's called the ALARA principle. So that is as low as reasonably achievable. We can talk about ALARA principle for a whole afternoon if you want. For me, it's a little bit more practical. It's hazard identification, risk assessment, having appropriate controls to limit radiation exposure, and having a system in place where you monitor the effectiveness of those controls. And then finally, your regulations, I dare say, will have a dose limit in them. Very important that a dose limit does not apply to patients undergoing imaging or treatment. It's just justification that applies to the patient. But for workers, some may argue that we do get a benefit because we get paid to do our jobs. But we don't benefit really from a health perspective, so we are subject to dose limits, which eliminate the risk of any tissue effects from radiation and keep our risk from our stochastic risk acceptably low. So in the radiation regulations in Victoria, Australia, which changed a couple of years ago, they now directly reflect the latest ICRP recommendations. So the exact wording is 100 millisieverts over a 5-year period and no more than 50 in a 12-month period. I just like to call it 20 millisieverts a year for the purposes of optimization. Different parts of our body have a different dose equivalent limit. As I mentioned, 20 millisieverts to the eye over a 12-month period. Now, skin and hands and feet being a bit less sensitive, but a higher dose limit. And your local regulations as well, I expect will have a clause that any radiation dose assessments to workers have to be recorded and probably stored for a set period of time. 50 years or so is fairly typical. So in summary, our surveys are an important part of verification of the effectiveness of shielding. You do need to plan the survey appropriately, correct your beam parameters, use the correct instrument, and write things down. Most national regulations can be traced back to ICRP recommendations, so our regulations will all look differently, but will all probably reflect ICRP recommendations, the key principles being justification, optimization, and limitation. The regulations will apply to the treatment of patients and the imaging of patients, as well as staff exposure. And I strongly encourage you to have an awareness of what regulations apply in your jurisdiction. So I will leave my presentation there, and I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have nearly taken up our 2 hours worth of summer school, and we've tried throughout.
Yes, that room is acceptable, or you're going to need additional shielding. So having a radiation survey written down and documented, and make sure that you keep it. We have situations here at Peter Mac where the only information I've been able to find on how thick is this barrier or what's down there was with some radiation survey reports that were done by physicists 20 years before I worked here. The architectural reports were long gone, but physicists, we like to keep our documentation. We don't destroy records, and it's the same with radiation survey reports. They come in extremely useful for all manner of purposes. So, in the interest of time, I might just go swiftly on, and I will hang around at the end of everything to answer any questions. And we've been talking for quite a while now, and I'm sure you can see the word regulatory framework, and it might sound a bit dry. And however, this is extremely important. The work we do with the use of radiation in medicine or anywhere is governed by the law. And what you do as a physicist and what you don't do as a physicist can end you up, facing the law. Don't want to scare anyone. I'm sure we all work for very well-run places, but this is not straightforward. And importantly, have a general awareness of the regulatory framework. So as I said, the use of radiation medicine, it's legislated, and whether that is for use on the patient, so there's regulations about when we direct a radiation beam at a patient, or we inject them with a radioactive material, there are laws that govern that practice. There are laws that govern us as workers. And the aim of the legislation has got several aims, and this is as broad as can be. The way I'm speaking to a very international audience, but in my opinion, the aim of legislation is we want to protect patients from harm. We're all here to benefit to patients, and so we need to protect patients from possible harm. We all know that radiation, if used incorrectly, has the potential to cause harm. So we need to minimise the risk of harm to patients as far as we can. At the same time, we need to maximise the benefits, because we all know that radiation brings enormous benefits to patients. Thomas has described how radiation kills tumour cells, and the radiation keeps people with cancer alive for longer and away for all manner of applications. So the use of radiation brings enormous benefits to the patient, to that patient's family, to the local community. So the safe use of radiation is an enormous benefit to mankind. At the same time, however, it's not without risk. And to us as workers, we need to minimise our exposure to radiation as low as is achievable, and certainly to below any regulatory limits. So where do the regulations come from? Well, the use of radiation has been around, I should know off the top of my head, but I don't, over 100 years in medicine at least. And people observed adverse effects with the use of radiation. And what I've shown to you here is the first ever ICRP guidance on radiation protection. What I'm trying to communicate with this slide is that we've known about the adverse effects of radiation for a long, long time. And the regulatory framework for using radiation is actually pretty mature. We've been refining our risk assessments of radiation. We've been continuously evaluating the risks and benefits and the controls over 100 years. So we have a very mature framework for the safe use of radiation. So ICRP, who I introduced on that slide there, they are an international organisation based in Canada, I think, with a few offices around the world. They are an independent group of scientists. They're a registered charity, and their mission is essentially to advance the science of radiation protection for public benefit, and public means everyone. We've got numerous governance committees, but their practical work comes from 4 main committees. So they have a group of dosimetry. Medicine has its own committee because the use of radiation medicine is the biggest application of radiation in the world. We have essentially more medical applications. So the committees, look, I'm fair to say that they're fairly dominated by North American and European people, but they do try and reach out across the world as much as possible. And I'm sure there's people from your countries that are on ICRP committees. I know that Australia has traditionally been fairly well represented in the ICRP. So these committees are then broken down.
Michael, are you still